The hum was the first thing you noticed in the ER of St. Jude's Metropolitan. A low, constant thrum of fluorescent lights, the digital symphony of a dozen heart monitors beeping in discordant rhythm, the squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum. It was a soundscape of controlled chaos, a place where life and death were separated by a thin veil of antiseptic and procedure. And in the middle of it all, almost invisible, was Clara. To the casual observer, Clara Evans was part of the background hum, a woman in her late 40s with more gray in her tightly pinned hair than was fashionable, and a face etched with lines that spoke of exhaustion, not wisdom. She moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a stutter in her gait that made her seem perpetually hesitant. Her hands, when she wasn't clenching them in the pockets of her scrubs, carried a fine tremor. She was the night nurse everyone overlooked, the one who cleaned the spills no one else wanted to, who restocked the crash carts with a quiet, almost obsessive precision. She spoke in whispers, her eyes perpetually downcast, as if apologizing for the space she occupied. Tonight, she was on her knees, wiping a slick of saline and something coppery from the floor of Trauma Bay 2. The overhead lights reflected off the wet tiles, making her squint. "Evans, are you going to take all night?" The voice was sharp, a scalpel of pure arrogance cutting through the ER's ambient noise. Dr. Preston Sterling stood over her, his custom-tailored scrubs immaculate, his $2,000 shoes a safe distance from the mess. He was the golden boy of St. Jude's, a top cardiothoracic surgeon with an Ivy League pedigree and an ego that required its own zip code. "Almost done, doctor," Clara murmured, not looking up. The smell of the antiseptic cleaner was sharp in her nostrils. "Almost isn't good enough. We have standards here. This isn't some backwater clinic." He gestured vaguely with a manicured hand. "Some of us have a reputation to maintain. Your slowness reflects poorly on my entire department." Jessica, a younger nurse who orbited Sterling like a sycophant moon, stifled a giggle behind her clipboard. "She's trying her best, Dr. Sterling. It's just, her best is a little slow." Clara's knuckles whitened on the wad of paper towels. "Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The cadence was old, a familiar mantra from a different life, a different kind of hell. She focused on the circular motion of her hand, scrubbing a spot that was already clean. The tremor in her fingers worsened. It always did when he was near. He saw it as weakness, incompetence. She knew it was something else entirely. It was the memory of sand and heat and pressure, the ghost of a trigger she'd never pulled. "Just get it done and then go check the inventory," Sterling commanded, already turning away, his attention captured by something more important on his phone. "Even you can probably handle counting gauze pads without incident." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara didn't respond. She simply finished her task, disposed of the soiled towels, and rose slowly, her right knee protesting with a dull ache. The limp was always worse when she was tired. She glanced at the clock. 2:17. The graveyard shift was a long, dark tunnel, and she was only halfway through. An hour later, the tension escalated. A patient in bed 6, a man recovering from a minor car accident, began to show subtle signs of distress. His O2 saturation had dipped by 2 points, and his respiratory rate had ticked up. It was nothing dramatic, nothing the central monitors would flag as critical, but it was a change. Clara saw it instantly. It was a pattern she recognized, a whisper before the scream. She found Dr. Sterling at the nurse's station, regaling Jessica with a story about his recent yachting trip. "Excuse me, doctor," Clara said, her voice barely audible. Sterling sighed, a theatrical display of annoyance. "What is it now, Evans? Did you run out of tongue depressors?" "It's the patient in bed 6, she said, keeping her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. "His sats are trending down, and his breathing is shallow. I think we should check for a pulmonary embolism." Sterling actually laughed, a short, cruel bark. "You think? You, the woman who moves at the speed of continental drift, have a medical opinion? Evans, your job is to change bedpans and follow my orders, not to play diagnostician. I looked at his chart an hour ago. He's fine. Probably just having a nightmare about the hospital food." Jessica smirked. Maybe she read about it in a magazine at the checkout counter. "I just have a feeling," Clara started, but her voice trailed off under the weight of his glare. "A feeling?" Sterling stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. Let me tell you something. I have an MD from Harvard. I have a fellowship from Johns Hopkins. I have 15 years of experience saving lives. You have a mop. Do you understand the difference? Now get back to your station and do not bother me with your feelings again unless someone is actively on fire. Humiliation burned hot in Clara's chest. She gave a curt, jerky nod and retreated, her face a stoic mask. She walked back toward bed 6, her gut twisting. She knew she was right. The body tells a story her first instructor had drilled into her. You just have to learn how to read it. This man's body was telling a story of a clot, a silent killer moving through his veins. But she had no power here. She was just the quiet, broken old nurse. The first sign that the night was about to shatter came not as a sound, but as a vibration. A deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that resonated through the concrete skeleton of the hospital. It grew louder, a predatory heartbeat in the night sky. The windows of the ER began to rattle. "What in God's name is that?" Sterling snapped, looking up from his phone. The sound became a roar, a physical force that pressed in on them. Red and white lights strobed through the windows, painting the sterile walls in frantic, flashing colors. A helicopter. Not a medevac bird. This was bigger, louder, angrier. It sounded like war. Security guards ran towards the roof access doors, their radios crackling with panicked voices. The ER doors burst open, and 2 men in black tactical gear, rifles held at a low ready, swept the room with terrifying efficiency. They were followed by a team of paramedics moving a gurney at a full run. On the gurney was a man, also in tactical gear, his body a canvas of blood and brutalized flesh. "Clear Trauma Bay 1!" one of the armed men yelled, his voice a gravelly command that tolerated no argument. "We have a GSW to the upper thoracic, massive hemorrhaging, possible collapsed lung. Go!" The ER staff, Sterling included, were frozen for a half second, stunned by the sheer force of the intrusion. This wasn't a car crash victim. This was something else entirely. Sterling, recovering first, puffed out his chest. "This is my emergency room. Who the hell are you?" The lead operator, a man with a face like a clenched fist and the call sign Reaper on his vest, didn't even look at him. His focus was on the man on the gurney. "He's a SEAL, Priority 1 asset. You will save him, or this hospital will have a very bad night. Are we clear?" The threat, naked and absolute, hung in the air. Sterling, for once, was speechless. He rushed to the trauma bay, the rest of the team scrambling behind him. Clara, drawn by the familiar, terrible energy of it all, followed, staying near the door, a ghost in the background. The scene in Trauma Bay 1 was organized panic. Sterling was shouting orders, but his voice had a high, reedy pitch of someone out of their depth. The patient's armor had been cut away, revealing a devastating wound high on the left side of his chest. Blood was everywhere. "Get me 2 units of ONEG now. I need a chest tube tray. Someone get me a pressure on him." "BP is 60 over palp. He's bottoming out," a nurse yelled. "He's in V-TACH." The patient's body arched on the table, a violent convulsive spasm. Then, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor devolved into a single, terrifying, continuous tone. Flatline. "He's coding!" Sterling grabbed the defibrillator paddles. "Charging to 200, clear!" The body jumped. The flatline remained. "Again! Charging to 360, clear!" Another jump. Nothing. "Damn it!" Sterling slammed a fist on the gurney. "The wound is too severe. There's too much internal bleeding." From her position by the door, Clara saw it. It wasn't just the bleeding. It was the distended veins in the patient's neck, the tracheal deviation she could just make out, the sickeningly asymmetrical rise and fall of his chest before he arrested. It was a classic textbook presentation, a story she had read 100 times before in Dust and Smoke. Tension, pneumothorax. Air was filling his chest cavity, crushing his lung, squeezing his heart until it could no longer beat. The defibrillator was useless. He was drowning on the inside. "Stop compressions," a voice said, low but clear, cutting through the panic. Everyone froze. The voice was unrecognizable. It held no tremor, no apology. It was a blade of pure, cold steel. They turned to see Clara step out of the shadows. Her posture had changed. She was no longer stooped. She stood straight, her shoulders back, her eyes scanning the monitor, the patient, the room, with an intensity that was frightening. The limp was gone, replaced by a solid, planted stance. Sterling stared at her, dumbfounded. Evans? What did you say? Get out of here. I said stop compressions, she repeated, her voice dropping an octave, resonating with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from her. She pushed past a stunned Jessica and pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the monitor. Look at the monitor. PEA. He has electrical activity but no pulse. You're shocking a dead man. He needs a needle decompression. Now. That's insane, Sterling sputtered. His lung isn't collapsed. His left lung is completely collapsed and you're missing it, Clara stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. You have less than a minute before his brain is soup. Get me a 14-gauge catheter and a betadine swab. The two armed SEALs who had been standing guard by the door had moved closer. They weren't looking at the doctor anymore. They were looking at Clara. They recognized the tone, the certainty, the absolute command presence. It was a language they understood better than any other. Do what she says, Reaper, the team leader, growled at a terrified-looking resident. The resident, caught between two terrifying authorities, chose the one with the gun. He fumbled in a drawer and produced the catheter. Clara snatched it from him. She moved to the patient's left side, her movements economical, precise, and shockingly fast. There was no hesitation. Her trembling hands were now rock-steady as if carved from stone. "This is assault!" Sterling shrieked. "I'll have you arrested. You're just a nurse." Clara didn't even glance at him. Her focus was absolute. Her fingers palpated the patient's chest. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She found the spot instantly. She swabbed the area with a single efficient wipe. "You are a liability, doctor," she said, her voice arctic. "Now stand aside and let me save your patient." She didn't wait for a response. With a controlled, powerful motion, she plunged the large-bore needle deep into the man's chest, just above the third rib. There was a sudden, audible hiss, the sound of trapped air escaping a high-pressure cavity. It was a sound of life returning. On the monitor, the flatline broke. A weak, thready rhythm appeared. Then another beat, and another. Sinus bradycardia. Then a steady, normal sinus rhythm. The entire room was silent, save for the now steady beep of the monitor. They stared, mouths agape, at the quiet old nurse who had just performed a miracle with a needle. Clara was already moving on. "He's stabilizing, but he's still critical. We need to get a chest tube in him, push 2 more units of O-neg, and get him to an OR 5 minutes ago. I need a full trauma panel and someone get me his core temp." She was no longer Clara Evans, the timid night nurse. She was a field general commanding her troops on the battlefield, and to everyone's shock, the ER staff, including the nurses who had mocked her, began to move, following her orders without question. They recognized competence when they saw it. Reaper, the SEAL team leader, stepped up beside her. He looked at the needle still protruding from his teammate's chest. Then he looked at the intricate, perfectly applied pressure, dressing on the primary wound, a dressing Clara hadn't even touched. "That's a Kressler field suture," he said, his voice quiet with awe. "I've only ever seen one person do that. It holds under extreme pressure, keeps the wound packed. You only learn that in one place." He leaned in, studying her face, his eyes narrowing. He saw the old scar tucked just behind her ear, a faint white line she usually hid with her hair. His eyes went wide with dawning recognition. "Angel 6? He whispered, the name a mix of disbelief and reverence. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Evans, is that you?" Clara finally looked at him, her eyes meeting his. The hard mask on her face softened for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of shared memory, of a bond forged in fire and loss. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Just then, the doors to the ER flew open again. This time it was the hospital administrator, a man named Henderson, flanked by 2 people in dark suits with FBI credentials. Dr. Sterling, seeing his chance to regain control, immediately pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "Arrest her! Arrest that woman!" he screeched, his face purple with rage. "She assaulted my patient! She performed a procedure she is not licensed for! She nearly killed him!" The FBI agent, a tall woman with tired eyes, ignored him completely. She walked over to the gurney where the wounded SEAL was beginning to stir, his eyes fluttering open. "Commander," the agent said softly, "Commander Phillips, can you hear me?" The man on the gurney, Commander Phillips, groaned. His eyes tried to focus. They drifted around the room, hazy with pain and morphine, before landing on Clara. a flicker of recognition. "Angel," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Is that you?" The agent's head snapped toward Clara. She looked at this unassuming middle-aged nurse and then back at the commander of DevGru Team 3. Reaper stepped forward, placing himself between Sterling and Clara. He looked directly at the FBI agent. "This woman didn't assault anyone. She just saved Commander Phillips's life. Doctor, Sterling here was about to call time of death." "She's a nurse," Sterling protested weakly. "No," Reaper said, his voice dropping, filled with a dangerous calm. "She's not. That is Lieutenant Commander Clara Evans, United States Navy, retired. She was the Senior Special Operations Combat Medic attached to the Joint Special Operations Command for 12 years. They called her Angel 6 because she was the 6th operator in Angel Platoon and because she brought back men from hell that God himself had given up on." He pointed to Clara's right leg. "That limp is from an IED blast outside Fallujah that took out half her team. She shielded 2 of her men with her own body and then spent the next 4 hours keeping them alive while under enemy fire after taking shrapnel to her leg and torso." He looked at her hands. "That tremor is from nerve damage from the same blast. It's also the reason she was medically retired." He turned his gaze back to Sterling, and the contempt in his eyes was a physical thing. "She has forgotten more about trauma medicine than you will ever learn in your entire pampered life. That Navy Cross and 2 silver stars on her record say so." The room was utterly silent. Henderson, the administrator, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Jessica, the young nurse, was pale, staring at Clara as if seeing her for the first time. Dr. Sterling's face had gone from purple to a pasty, bloodless white. His entire world, built on a foundation of credentials and arrogance, had just been demolished by a quiet woman with a limp. The FBI agent finally spoke, her professional demeanor back in place, but her eyes held a new, profound respect. She looked at the masterful work Clara had done, the life saved against all odds. She turned to her. "Ma'am," she said, the honorific tasting strange and yet perfectly appropriate. "We need to know what happened to the commander. We have questions about the ambush." She paused, her gaze fixed on the perfectly placed needle in Phillips's chest. "But first, I have to ask, where did you learn to do that in 4 minutes?" Clara finally looked away from her patient. She looked at the agent, at the stunned faces around her, at the man whose life she had just pulled back from the brink. The ghost of a smile touched her lips, tired but real. "Afghanistan," she said, her voice quiet again, but with no trace of the tremor. "You learn to work fast when the alternative is filling out a KIA report for one of your own." Henderson, the administrator, finally found his voice. He walked over to Sterling, his face a mask of cold fury. "Dr. Sterling, you are fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Your credentials and your ego are a liability we can no longer afford." As security guards flanked a sputtering, defeated Sterling, Clara turned back to her patient. The young, kind-hearted aide who had always offered her a word of encouragement slipped a cup of fresh, hot coffee into her steady hand. There were tears in the young woman's eyes. Reaper and the other SEAL stood by her, a silent, unbreachable honor guard. The war was over for her, but the brotherhood, she knew, was forever. She took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her. For the first time in years, the hum of the ER didn't sound like chaos. It sounded like home.